So I went to the doctor. I had a very prominent obstetrician in Milwaukee. I can't do anything for you. Come back and see me the day after, and I'll see if everything's okay.
When I was in college, there was a fake wedding ring, and this wedding ring was passed around among a whole bunch of women, and we would wear it to go to a doctor to get a diaphragm. We were breaking the law. We were doing it collectively, but we did not feel that what we were doing was wrong.
When I was in nursing school, there was absolutely no education about any kind of contraception or birth control at all. So I was quite amazed that there even were such things that existed as the diaphragm.
Birth control is very controversial, in part because sex outside of procreation is very controversial.
And I don't care how they do it or what they do, women should have the right to determine for themselves the number and spacing of their children. And if they can do that, then they can do whatever they want in their lives.
The reason the movement began was because for the first time in human history, birth control had been prohibited. That's what's new, is the prohibition on birth control, not the existence of it. There has been birth control as long as there have been human beings. There has never been a society in which people did not try to control their reproduction. So there's just centuries and centuries of history of women and men trying various things, some of which actually worked pretty well, some of which did not.
Coitus interruptus, or withdrawal, was the most widely used method to prevent pregnancy. Women ingested herbs and plants, inserted pebbles, stones, buttons, and other small items into their uteruses. Men wore sheaths made out of leather, linen, silk, animal intestines, and/or oiled paper. For thousands of years all over the world, these methods prevailed and saw continual reinvention to improve their effectiveness.
The story of birth control in this country begins before the 20th century. Indeed, it begins in the 19th century. In 1800, a native-born, middle-class white woman would be expected to have about 7 children over the course of her lifetime. But by 1900, that had dropped to about 3.5 children. So women and men are doing something. Now, lots of this is going to be delayed marriage. People are just getting married later. They're also having less sex, perhaps, during marriage, understanding that sex leads to children. But there are all sorts of devices that are also available.
Pessaries, an earlier model of the diaphragm, were a very popular method.
You can order them from overseas, you can buy them at certain shops, you can get information from books that tell you how to make your own.
Women turned common household goods into contraceptive devices. They made vaginal inserts out of sea sponges dipped in olive oil or boric acid. They inserted a pat of salted butter or a sliver of soap. They douched with vinegar and other cleaning agents. They sliced a lemon in half to cap their cervixes. Men wore a toy balloon as a condom. One birth control manual recommended that, in a pinch, the woman sit up immediately after intercourse and cough as hard as possible.
You know, when you were practicing rudimentary self-invented birth control, you really had to have abortion as a backup because it was so often ineffective.
Before 1860, abortion is legal in this country before quickening.
Through most of Catholic history, the belief was that early on in a pregnancy, you don't have a baby. St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas both held that the early embryo, the early fetus, has the moral status of a plant. And somewhere around 3 or 4 months, or many of them thought quickening, there's enough there for God to put a soul into it. That was the way they phrased it. And at that point, only could you talk about a baby.
And so before women could feel a baby move inside of them, there was a different sort of understanding of their relationship to pregnancy. And there were all sorts of things women could do to restore menstruation, is what this would often be called. I think we need to sort of see abortion and birth control in the 19th century as of a piece, as not different processes in the minds of these women.
Toward the end of the 19th century, abstaining from sex gained popularity as a method of birth control.
Just giving women the right to say no to sexual intercourse was one of the first organized birth control strategies, this movement called voluntary motherhood. This doesn't sound like a very satisfactory form of birth control, but to give women control over their fertility like this, if it's only by saying no, I think it's important in this history.
The name that would eventually rise out of these early birth control leagues, Planned Parenthood, harkens back to this concept. Women should be mothers when they are able to care for their children.
Concern about birth control is linked to a larger concern about infant mortality and maternal mortality. Even this voluntary motherhood movement that goes from the 1870s to the 1890s makes the argument that women should be able to control their fertility so that they can be better mothers.
Controlling fertility by an artificial method, however, would soon be challenged.
What really changes the status of birth control in this country are the Comstock laws.
Anthony Comstock was born into a self-declared pious Connecticut family. A member of the Social Purity Crusaders, he lobbied Congress to outlaw obscenity. He quietly tucked his notions of what was obscene into a postal commerce bill, which passed in 1873.
The Comstock law said that there was to be no obscene matter sent through the U.S. mail.
He's able to label all contraceptive devices and information as obscene.
And that included not only actual birth control devices, not only instructional material about how to use birth control, but it even included abstract philosophical debate about whether the control of reproduction was a good or a bad idea.
This censorship began as a federal law and affected interstate commerce, but states quickly began to pass their own little Comstock laws, which expanded the definition of articles deemed obscene. This legislation at the state level effectively made birth control illegal in the United States.
This, of course, doesn't make it go away, but it does drive it underground.
It would take more than 100 years to overturn each state's little Comstock laws. Wisconsin was the last state to do so in 1976.
Large-scale circulation of information had to be done illegally. And in a certain sense, you might say that it turned every man and woman who was trying to control their family size into a criminal.
Of course, the legal status of contraception had little, if any, effect on people's desire to use it.
By the year, say, 1916, there was a birth control league in every major city in the United States and many smaller towns as well. It was, in a way, as important to a lot of women as the struggle for the vote.
In 1915, the National Birth Control League began, followed by the Voluntary Parenthood Association in 1919.
And in 1921, Sanger founds the American Birth Control League, which is the precursor to what we now know as the Planned Parenthood Federation.
Margaret Sanger, outspoken advocate for birth control, offers her cure for the depression.
Every working man knows that it is far better and easier to bring 2 children into the world and provide for them decently on the average wage of $35 a week than it is to have 8 or 10 children on the same wage.
And Margaret Sanger is a socialist, she's an agnostic, she's a radical in all sorts of ways. And she gets into the birth control movement by her work as a nurse.
As the story goes, Margaret Sanger was nursing a woman back to health after she suffered life-threatening complications from an illegal abortion. The patient, Sadie Sachs, was a poor mother who already had 3 children she could barely care for. This experience was Margaret Sanger's introduction to the plight of women who had no means to control their family size.
Sadie Sachs begs Margaret Sanger for information about how to prevent more births, and Sanger doesn't know what to tell her. Certainly she's not allowed to say anything, and she doesn't even know what she would say if she could.
Sadie Sachs returns to the clinic a few months later after having another illegal abortion and dies. This radicalizes Margaret Sanger to the cause of birth control, and she works tirelessly to establish more birth control clinics across the country.
When my wife wanted contraceptive care, she went to the Margaret Sanger Clinic in Manhattan.
If she hadn't done it, who knows where we'd have been now. I feel very strongly that she had a lot of guts to do what she did. And she had a lot of people who believed in her, and that's why there's Planned Parenthoods all over the United States.
The path to a national network of clinics was a slow one. Not only did the Comstock Law hover over those who sought birth control, so did an objection to preventing pregnancy through artificial means. In 1930, there were only 55 clinics in the entire country. But with the judicial decision that contraception was legal if used to prevent disease, birth control clinics could proliferate.
The history of Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin closely parallels the history of the birth control movement in the United States.
By 1942, there are over 800 birth control clinics in this country.
The clinic in Milwaukee was opened, the first birth control clinic by Dr. Edith McCann.
Dr. McCann was a socially progressive obstetrician and gynecologist in Milwaukee. She believed strongly in health education and the advancement of women's status. In 1935, she founded what we now know as Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin and acted as medical director until 1954. She worked with a charter of 4 women who researched and disseminated family planning information. Child spacing, infertility, marriage, and parenting was their focus. Like others of its kind across the country, this tiny clinic wanted to join the national birth control movement.
There was a large national organization called the Birth Control Federation of America, BCFA.
And then in 1949, they decided to become affiliated with the national, which was Planned Parenthood Federation.
The change to the name Planned Parenthood came in the 1940s. And in some ways it was a compromise, because by then the term birth control was a little radical for a lot of people. So people developed a strategy of trying to appeal with a name that was more neutral, Planned Parenthood.
Following national trends, the concept of birth control was radical in Wisconsin at this time, especially in Planned Parenthood's home base, Milwaukee.
The medical school was run by a predominantly Catholic group.
Religious sentiment against birth control affected patients' access to birth control as well as family planning training for medical providers.
They taught the rhythm system at Marquette and no artificial means of contraception.
I went to medical school in the Netherlands and we were extensively trained in family planning there. So that probably is very different than the US experience was at that time.
This wheel, which is a rhythm cycloscope, I call it a gambling wheel. It's like gambling, you took a chance.
This gambling system was also the method dispensed at County General Hospital in Milwaukee.
There was a gag rule on educating women after they had a baby at County Hospital about family planning.
Despite such restrictions, the need for birth control remained, and the desire to provide it grew among medical practitioners. Planned Parenthood would soon hire its first executive director, Margaret Miller.
Bill Willis and I hired Margaret Miller, and she really did a job for Planned Parenthood in this city and in the nation.
She said, well, there's an opening at Planned Parenthood Association of Milwaukee for the position of executive director. And I said, I don't know anything about Planned Parenthood Association of Milwaukee.
It was just a small clinic, part-time hours, that kind of thing. Margaret Miller was the first executive director of Planned Parenthood of Milwaukee, and that's really when things began to change.
Margaret, for us, has been sort of the standard. She set the standard.
Margaret Miller was a phenomenon. Margaret Miller brought to Planned Parenthood a combination of intelligence, compassion, and vision.
I think the major problem that faced the agency at that time was its anonymity. You rarely saw anything in the papers about it. That's why I never really knew about Planned Parenthood.
Margaret Miller felt strongly that in order to increase support for the organization and access for its patients, Planned Parenthood needed to be much more visible in the community.
I had finished nursing school, and there really was no place that I was aware of at that point in time. And I had grown up in Milwaukee, so I was pretty familiar with the city. So it was kind of neat to know that there were actually women out there, mostly volunteers, who were helping women who needed birth control.
Margaret Miller's vision matched an era that was about to explode with new family planning options.
Before that time, all we had to offer basically were diaphragms and condoms, and some of the clinics didn't even stock condoms. Isn't that amazing?
Now, the problem with condoms and a diaphragm, as I saw it, was it didn't work because nobody used them. Our philosophy at Planned Parenthood was whatever method you choose, if you use it, it'll help. If you don't.
Oral contraceptives were released in 1960, and these tiny little pills would change the face of birth control forever.
I happened to arrive the same year that the pill was released on the market, and this was the beginning of a great expansion in the area of family planning, and certainly for Planned Parenthood.
Until 1920, physicians did not understand the human fertility cycle. After they discovered the role of hormones of the natural hormonal cycle over a month's time in a woman, then they began to experiment with interfering with that hormonal cycle.
By the 1950s, Sanger and other folks in the birth control movement are thinking that there really needs to be a better way. She starts in her head, not knowing anything about the science, thinking surely there's got to be a way to really sever reproduction from sexuality through a pill. She had a wealthy friend, Catherine McCormick, who was also interested in women's rights more generally.
Sanger asked Catherine McCormick to fund research for a birth control pill. McCormick accepted the challenge, at which point the two women sought a scientist to realize their dream. Dr. Gregory Pincus entered the project and developed the pill in his laboratory.
Planned Parenthood of Milwaukee decided to do a one-year experiment that same year, 1960, offering the birth control pill to 100 of its patients.
Planned Parenthood again encountered objection to their efforts when Archbishop William Cozzens publicly opposed birth control research and use.
Which methods have not been tried to a point where they can now say there are no side effects. The church then cannot possibly put its stamp of approval upon a medical or a pill means, an ovulation deterrent of some sort or depressant of some sort, without knowing whether or not there are going to be side effects.
Planned Parenthood responded with a press release stating, quote, "The Archbishop is obviously entitled to his opinions about the morality of birth control. The only issue here is whether methods of family planning, which are freely available to more affluent families in Milwaukee, shall be made available and easily accessible to impoverished families in the low-income areas who want them," unquote. Single women also had trouble accessing birth control.
The beginning of the women's movement at the very end of the 1960s, the policy of Planned Parenthood was that they would not serve unmarried women. And people in the women's movement were furious about that.
For Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin, this was not a policy of the organization. It was a state law.
Every state had to abolish its laws against birth control. And that struggle took more than 4 decades.
We were always looking over our shoulders because at that time birth control was illegal for single women in the state of Wisconsin. And of course, we were treating single women because that was a high-risk population.
When I arrived at Planned Parenthood, they were requiring that a single person show proof that they were about to be married.
So people would bring in wedding rings, true or false. They would bring in licenses.
The wedding license.
The wedding license or the certificate of marriage.
Planned Parenthood continued serving all of their patients without directly breaking the law.
At that point in time, we did not have any kind of federal funding. And so I remember one day saying to Margaret and Fran, I don't really know why we're asking people if they're married. If we don't need that information, why don't we just avoid that question altogether?
In order to respect the decisions and needs of their patients, this is precisely what they did. Stop asking the question of whether or not the patient was married.
These laws put physicians in this position as kind of moral gatekeepers. So for a long time, even married women, forget unmarried women, had to go through this tremendously humiliating process of going to a doctor as a supplicant and pleading and perhaps exaggerating how terrible it would be if you had yet another child, giving him the authority to decide something so basic about her life.
I remember talking with a woman who had come to us in the mid-60s and had said, I was one of those early people came in, and she said, I was just terrified. I was just terrified that someone was going to ask me the question. And you didn't ask me, and you made me feel comfortable.
While Planned Parenthood in Milwaukee did its best to serve all people in need, unmarried couples outside of the Milwaukee area had little or no access to family planning services.
I had heard of Planned Parenthood and talked to several other people. A group of us got our heads together and decided we would find out about Planned Parenthood and start a clinic in Dane County.
But once the group discovered state laws banning birth control, opening their clinic became more complicated. For instance, no employees of the Public Health Department or Welfare Department could discuss birth control with their clients. When asked about issues of family planning, they were instructed to give one stock answer.
You should see your doctor or your minister or your priest. Well, ministers and priests can't do much about medicine, and those people didn't have doctors. There was no medical system for poor people.
And there was no system whatsoever for unmarried people. Similar to the Comstock law before it, the Wisconsin law classified all birth control devices as indecent articles. This restriction put tremendous restraints on the services that Planned Parenthood could legally provide, and in order for the organization to expand, the law had to be overturned.
We were visited by a group from Madison, Wisconsin, who wanted to form a Planned Parenthood affiliate. When we talked with them, I said to them, you know, you're right in Madison. It would be so much better if you just got the law changed for us. And that gave rise to Wisconsin Citizens for Family Planning.
We thought that day in the car as we talked about it that this was such a ridiculous law that if it were just brought to people's attention, they would change it.
And these wonderful ladies really, for the next almost 10 years, devoted themselves to trying to change the law.
We had to create this awareness and this battle. It was on, but we had to let everybody know about it.
Their work did not go unnoticed by supporters or by opponents.
Let's get to the root of the problem, which is the illicit relationship and not the illegitimate birth.
How would you do that, ma'am?
Well, of course, we go back now to the moral tone of the community. Either we are going to have standards and have people who are going to say these are our standards and help these youngsters in living according to those standards, or we are having what we are today, a definite decline in the moral climate.
We contacted every organization in the state that had a statewide constituency that we thought could have any reason to care about our issue.
The group was also in regular contact with legislators and found their greatest support in State Senator Fred Risser. Despite Senator Risser's strong support, Bee Kabler and her citizens group found significant opposition in the legislature.
Why did the legislature bypass acting on this past session?
I think they were positively petrified by the false propaganda issued by the opposition. I mean, such utter rot as they put out is disgraceful.
The Wisconsin Citizens for Family Planning initiated a study to better educate both the public and the legislature about the effects of this law.
We had a good chance to pass our bill by the head count, but when that public hearing happened, our idea went down the tubes in a hurry.
What is there to study about whether or not unmarried people should be given contraceptives? I think the answer is obvious, and no study is indicated. The availability of contraceptives to the married people is here. We have Planned Parenthood clinics operating and functioning, and of course, if this is not legal, we wonder why they're functioning. So that obviously the distribution of contraceptives to the married is available.
Single people finally gained the same rights as those who were married when Governor Patrick Lucey overturned the antiquated Wisconsin law in 1976. The Wisconsin Citizens for Family Planning were finally able to open their clinic 10 years after their initial meeting with Margaret Miller.
When we got our little group together, we came home from Milwaukee and said, okay, we're going to start our clinic, and Ben was there to help.
Dr. Ben Peckham was the department chair of obstetrics and gynecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison Medical School. He was also the head of the residency program as well.
He went any place he could to find patients for his residents to learn on, because you can't learn how to do a pelvic on a plastic doll.
Dr. Peckham needed patients to train his residents in family planning services, and the new Planned Parenthood clinic needed a physician. It was a perfect fit.
We talked to B. Kabler and Dr. Peckham and really moved next door, the whole staff, and became Planned Parenthood.
This was the beginning of a statewide network. After the first clinic in Milwaukee, other clinics opened in Kenosha, Green Bay, and Sheboygan. Expansion continued all over the state for the next 30 years.
Planned Parenthood of Milwaukee changed its name to Planned Parenthood Association of Wisconsin, and this reflected the growth of the chapters around the state.
While Planned Parenthood expanded, limited funding kept each clinic small, relying on volunteer support and ingenuity to provide services.
I made all of the appointments from my home phone, and we, carried the charts back. I kept the cultures in the refrigerator, and then we had some other equipment in my basement. And when we came to work, we had no time clocks, and everybody worked until the job was done. And we were just really serious.
Along with Ida, another committed nurse at the new Madison Clinic, was Elaine McLeod. Elaine worked at Planned Parenthood for over 20 years as a volunteer, employee, and advocate. She was also very involved in the Republicans for Choice movement.
I don't think we would have made it without Elaine McLeod. We just wouldn't have. I remember Elaine McLeod bringing her boys into the office and scrubbing and waxing the floors because we couldn't afford cleaning people.
By 1965, the expanding financial needs of the health centers and patient demand required Planned Parenthood to explore other funding options.
Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin, through Margaret Miller, our dynamic executive director, saw the possibilities that the federal money might become available.
The OEO in the anti-poverty program has now made family planning one of its national emphasis programs, along with Head Start. So, in other words, outside of the very humanitarian idea of the unwanted child is the fact that now the federal government realizes that family planning is one of the greatest ways to combat poverty.
Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin was the first affiliate in the country to apply for these anti-poverty funds. However, when the Milwaukee City Common Council discovered this application, they introduced a resolution to block it.
The resolution said that no public funds could be spent for birth control in the city. That really was devastating.
We were the only affiliate not to get the money.
Despite its own setback, Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin had laid the groundwork for other affiliates to apply for and secure this funding. In 1970, under the Nixon administration, Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin was finally awarded funding with the establishment of Title X, the Federal Family Planning Act.
It provided us with the opportunity to provide services to far more women in the state of Wisconsin than we certainly could have ever served with only private donations and the donations that we got from patients.
In addition to increasing services for women, more funding meant that Planned Parenthood could provide reproductive health services to men as well.
Planned Parenthood was one of the few organizations in Wisconsin that provided low-cost vasectomy services.
And we were the first affiliate in the country outside the headquarters of New York to set up a vasectomy service.
We thought it'd be such a gas to have a vasectomy program in a state where abortion was not to be considered.
Providing more services increased Planned Parenthood's public profile. Support for their work grew, along with continued opposition.
Believe it or not, You know, in these days of abortion and the excitement and controversy that is rampant, we had our own problems with controversy.
It calls for 500 doctor hours, 1,200 new patients, 1,200 old patients, allowing a total of a little over 11 minutes a patient for a history, a physical examination, follow-up treatment, and so forth. And gentlemen, I say that if this is the kind of medical care that we are imposing upon poor people in our city, this is an irresponsible action.
The doctors who work with Planned Parenthood are a small, dedicated, but highly vocal group of individuals who are attempting to impose their values upon the indigent people of our community.
Regardless of these long-standing criticisms of Planned Parenthood, there continued to be an increase in the number of people seeking services, especially those without a family doctor.
Planned Parenthood really was filling a gap between what well-off women could get very easily from their physicians and women who did not. And most of the women who came to Planned Parenthood in those early days were low-income women, with many of them with less than a high school level education, who already had 4 or 5 children.
Planned Parenthood continued to find creative ways to provide health care for the many people seeking family planning services.
We had traveling roadshows where we took all of our supplies and equipment and went to like basements of churches and set up an
community
exam
centers.
room.
We'd have a duffel bag with our speculums.
We bought a very, very high quality stretcher that we had custom made with stirrups for the exam. We had a ramp and we rolled it into a Volkswagen bus that said, you know, Planned Parenthood in nice big letters on the side.
This effort, too, had its detractors.
They called that mobile clinic a sex mobile.
Oh, yes,
remember
right.
that? And they accused us of passing pills out on street corners to innocent children.
Nevertheless, the mobile clinic got around. There was a different location for each day of the week, covering a wide area of Milwaukee into Waukesha, where the clinic set up shop at the YWCA. The increase of locations combined with a limited number of physicians forced Planned Parenthood to develop a new model for providing care. Nurse practitioner programs were advancing in the field of pediatrics, and women's health nurse practitioners soon followed. Planned Parenthood wanted to fully integrate nurse practitioners, which required securing funding to create a training and education program.
In 1972, we had just recently received our first Title X grant, and along with the grant, they offered us training money.
Fran and Margaret Miller discussed the idea of using this training money to start a nurse practitioner program. Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin was the first program in the country to educate registered nurses using Title X funds.
When I came to her about the nurse practitioner program, she said, go for it.
And there were only 4 of us in the first class, and we ran it kind of small, but we had tremendous physician support.
We had to testify in Madison as to the capability of our nurse practitioners and how much they were able to do, and the fact that we had a physician backing them up.
With the nurse practitioner program established, a new era of care could begin.
In addition to the counseling and the education and the interviewing, we could now examine the patient and fit the diaphragm, insert the intrauterine device, treat a vaginal infection, take her pap smear, whatever she needed that was related to reproductive health care in our setting, we were able to provide.
One of the most critical roles of the nurse practitioner is to educate patients about sexuality and reproductive health. Learning about these issues outside of the clinic exam room, however, is just as crucial. Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin is home to the largest sexual health library in the Midwest, the Maurice Ritz Resource Center.
We have to have a real honest discussion in this state and in this country with an understanding that 14, 15, 16, 17, 18-year-olds are biologically, changing, and to pretend that isn't so is nonsense.
I just can't believe how backward we are compared to Western Europe in our acceptance of sexuality by young people. So many of them come into their adult years totally unprepared for the issues.
I hope that you as a mother, if you are one, I'm a mother of 5, will want your youngsters to have all the information they can have.
What I consider good information that will formulate character in my daughters is not necessarily what Planned Parenthood thinks is necessary to formulate good character in my daughters.
In what way has Planned Parenthood forced any value on you?
Every day in the newspapers, every day in the movies, every day in the school system.
Planned Parenthood doesn't have anything to do with the movies that are in the paper.
Your sex education classes are nothing but teaching 10-year-old girls how to be prostitutes.
Never mind that television is saturated with sex. Never mind that billboards are saturated with sexual images, or you open up a magazine or go to a movie and there are a million sexual images, but somehow access to birth control causes people to have sex.
I'm of a generation where your mother never told you a thing about sex and sexuality, and then I became a parent of a daughter, and I had no models in which to teach my daughter about sex education, so I called Planned Parenthood.
I've heard from other friends, oh, my daughter's getting older, I've got to have the talk. I've got to have the big talk with her about the birds and the bees, and I didn't feel that because we've been talking about it right along, always, in an age-appropriate way.
I didn't know what this hooking up was, dating with benefits or whatever, I can't remember. All the words that use, so you have to be able to communicate to your child in a language that they understand. And I think Wisconsin is a leader in that program.
My school certainly didn't talk about sex education at all, and I think it was helpful to have it be an open discussion in my house, certainly in my life, having my mother being involved in Planned Parenthood.
I think parents, for the most part, want to make sure that their children, as they're emerging into their teens and early adult years, that they're getting good information. That if there are issues that they feel uncomfortable talking over with their parents, that there are places that they can go to talk them over.
Many teens find it easiest to talk to their peers about sexuality. Planned Parenthood was the first family planning organization in the United States to institute a teen peer counseling program.
The concept that teens could teach teens had grown, but this is the first to hire teens to work within a Planned Parenthood or a family planning setting. That was a little risky, you might say, because what are you doing hiring teenagers to talk about birth control? It was tremendously successful.
I think a lot of kids first handoff don't know a lot about birth control at all. It's basically a word of mouth thing. They usually don't have accurate information, and they usually aren't even sure about whether they should be doing this or doing that or how to go about receiving health services. We do workshops. We go into schools, we go into detention centers, and we do a variety of topics about youth culture, about subcultures of youth, birth control, contraceptives, the usual type thing, but also about dating, what is an unhealthy relationship versus a healthy relationship, self-awareness, and different things like that.
In addition to helping teens educate other teens, Planned Parenthood helps foster good communication within families. However, not all families are able to communicate about sexuality.
It's an educational opportunity not only for the youth, but also for the parent, that there are people in the community that really can play this role and play it responsibly. It's a huge responsibility, and that's something that Planned Parenthood was very willing to do.
I hope that parents will become involved on their own without, as the Milwaukee Journal said, tattling on teens.
Planned Parenthood and the Department of Health and Social Services has too much influence.
Can Planned Parenthood promote that communication?
Well, we try. I think sometimes you're asking a lot of Planned Parenthood to ask us to put together families where there haven't been families or good communication in families before. I'm not a wizard, and I cannot put together what isn't there.
Every teenager has a right to understand their body, understand the possibilities of what's going on with their body, and understand how to protect themselves from disease, from unwanted pregnancy. I certainly wouldn't have had to have an abortion if I had known more about the services that they offered at the time.
That's what makes Planned Parenthood unique, is that we provide the health care that prevents the need for abortion. But abortion, legal abortion, will always be necessary.
Family planning, access to birth control, and comprehensive sexuality education help prevent the need for abortion. These make up more than 97% of Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin's services. But even the most informed couple may find themselves faced with an unplanned pregnancy. Despite the current debate surrounding abortion, objections to this option are relatively new in the history of birth control.
There's a strong Roman Catholic pro-choice tradition, including in its spokespersons even a saint, St. Antoninus in the 15th century, first Catholic to write at any extent at all on abortion, and he was pro-choice for early abortions, when necessary to save the woman, a big category in his day. And what they do with him, they canonized him a saint.
Prior to the 19th century, in almost every society, abortion was accepted as a matter of fact and was not usually illegal. It was not prohibited either by the law or by the church if it was done before so-called quickening.
The movement to criminalize abortion began in the American Medical Association. At the end of the 19th century, there were a variety of medical providers performing abortion services. Typically, those who provided abortion services were not physicians. The AMA stepped in to regulate the medical marketplace and determined that physicians would be the provider standard.
And regular physicians were not generally performing abortions. So by the 1880s, abortion was illegal in this country, in every state of the Union.
The legal status of abortion had no effect on whether or not a woman would seek an abortion, only on who performed them, where they took place, and what type of complications arose.
Doctors were seeing the carnage that was happening. They had whole wards in big cities just for botched abortions, and so we don't want to go back to that. That's unacceptable. That's barbarism.
When I was a medical student at Boston University, my concept of abdominal pain was not appendicitis. It was either gonorrhea, causing peritonitis, or a septic abortion. And I saw a good number of young women die as a result of, or become sterile for life, as a result of terrible abortion procedures that were done basically in a back alley shop.
We had just numerous requests for abortion. And at that time, of course, we were helpless. We couldn't refer them to anybody except through psychiatrists.
Therapeutic abortions gave regular physicians who were instrumental in making abortion illegal the right to determine who could still get a legal abortion. This was a huge loophole that a lot of women could walk through, particularly middle-class white women.
Referrals to underground abortion services were necessary for those who couldn't afford the therapeutic option.
It's hard to imagine what it must have felt like at the time to be pregnant, particularly pregnant and poor, and not even knowing where to start to get an abortion. And so just the idea of a referral service, it sounds so benign now, but this was crucial.
One day a young fella came in and said, "My girlfriend is pregnant, we want to find an abortion, what do I do?" When I went to ask Margaret Miller, how do I handle this? She said there is a clergy consultation service, a sort of underground, because certainly this was illegal.
In the 1960s, clergy members, Baptists, Congregationalists, Episcopalians, all kinds of folks were coming together, seeing it as what they needed to do for women.
Clergy referral services not only helped women find abortion providers, but worked diligently with state legislators to reform abortion laws. In the meantime, the business of referrals was a frightening one.
We had reassurance that these were competent physicians. We were not working with back alley butchers by any means.
There were places like New York and Chicago that we would send women to. So it was mostly out of state. It would be young girls who'd never been out of the state, would be taking a plane into New York, meeting someone in the airport, having the abortion, and flying home the same day.
I don't think I ever had fears that we somehow would be arrested or we would be in trouble with the law. I don't think that entered Margaret's head either. I think the worry was, what if this woman got into some sort of difficulty?
Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin's referrals were misinterpreted, and they were sued for allegedly convincing women to have abortions and for performing the procedure. Neither allegation was true, but lawyers representing the agency felt that Planned Parenthood couldn't risk further confusion.
They asked if I would mind continuing doing what I and my other counselors were doing, but not on the premises of Planned Parenthood until this lawsuit was settled.
Bonnie's program reinvented itself, found a new location, and became Problem Pregnancy Counseling Service.
Most people think about the legalization of abortion through the Supreme Court's decision in Roe v. Wade, which was 1973, ironically exactly 100 years after the Comstock Law. But it's actually not a Supreme Court matter.
Abortion was already available in New York and many other states. The impact of Roe v. Wade was that it would now be legal in every state.
Channel 4 called me at Problem Pregnancy Counseling Service, probably getting the name from Planned Parenthood again, and they wanted to know what I thought would happen now that Roe v. Wade was settled.
I think that it will make abortions more easily available to poor women where they have always been available fairly easily for wealthy women. They have in the past been having to go through 2 psychiatrists, and it's been rather difficult sometimes for them to do that. However, it is the lower middle class woman and the middle class woman that I'm hoping this decision will affect.
I told the reporter that I thought I would be out of business, and that would be a good thing that I could look for another job, because abortion would be safe, it would be legal, it would be available, and it was my great hope that it would be affordable.
For many years following Roe v. Wade, physicians in private practice were the primary abortion providers in Wisconsin. Almost 20 years passed before Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin's health centers would provide these services.
The transition from just providing reproductive health care to becoming a provider of AB services or abortion services was not easy.
My first board meeting was, I think, 2 months after I started, and the decision that was going to be made by the board was whether or not to do abortion services.
After going through a lot of discussion, we sat around a circle and each of us gave our personal feelings about this decision.
We lost the vote on starting services.
Up to then, we had certainly offered abortion counseling and referrals. Look at all the wonderful work Bonnie Joseph had done over the years. But to actually offer abortion services in one of our clinics was a new idea.
A year and a half later, the board reassessed the issue.
And I vividly remember several of the women who were on the board had had the experience of having friends die from botched abortions, and many tears, much emotion.
Yesterday, the Board of Directors of Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin voted to initiate abortion services.
Then it was a matter of finding a building. We had to buy a building or lease a building. We had to find a doctor. We had to get the money to do it. So that was probably another 2 years before we actually opened our door.
A Milwaukee area businessman, Bill Manley, agreed to rent his building on North Jackson Street to Planned Parenthood.
And then on a wonderful day, I had a meeting, which I didn't know was going to happen, with some anonymous donors who said, we would like to offer you the money to buy the building so that you will always have a permanent home and no one can kick you out.
Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin still resides in the Manley Building today, which also houses their headquarters. The triumph of finding a home was offset by the Reagan administration's threat to remove Title X funding from any organization that provided or counseled on abortion. Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin determined that they could not compromise abortion services for a federal gag rule. They turned down the money. They were the first affiliate in the country to take this bold stand.
At the time, Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin was the largest affiliate. I think we were serving over 100,000 patients.
Ultimately, it came down to whether or not our affiliate was going to say no to the money. which for us was several $1,000,000.
In the end, Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin did not lose the Title X funding. It turned out to be more an anti-choice ploy than a fiscal reality. But gag rules are a continual threat to health care providers. As the pattern had played itself out so many times before, Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin celebrated this victory while getting ready for the next challenge.
What a mighty God we serve.
The decision to provide abortion services meant gearing up for daily protests and even violence.
I've had a lot of hate mail. I've been stalked on one occasion. My house was picketed.
And they'd started in shooting doctors that did abortions. And we were alone out here. We had no neighbors. It was the first time I ever saw Ben afraid.
One of my colleagues made a comment that the anti-abortion terrorists might determine how long he might live, but they're not going to determine how well he lives. He's going to continue to do what he believes in.
When a national organized protest campaign came to town in 1992, Planned Parenthood had to protect their patients and the services they were seeking.
There were a number of years when the national anti-choice organizations picked a city or a state, and Milwaukee was chosen one of those years.
A group called the Missionaries to the Preborn led the protests. They targeted not just Planned Parenthood, but all clinics providing abortions in Milwaukee. They tried an unusual tactic that summer, using children as the primary protesters.
So if you're coming in and I stop him, I shouldn't be able to stop you. I might be able to stop too, but that's it. The rest of you ought to be immediately moving around.
They would run into the streets and yell at the women and say, don't go in there. And it was horrible for our patients. I mean, it was a great strategy. I gave them credit for it.
I was pregnant the summer of 1992. I was like 8 months pregnant that summer. And the police escorted me into work most mornings. And I got yelled and screamed at every morning about going in there to kill my baby. And I just thought it was so just incredibly crazy that with my stomach, out to here, that anybody would think that I was going inside that building to have an abortion.
Carloads of people would come streaming out of a parking lot, and they would lie down and they would close the clinic because the police would spend many hours hauling these people away.
It was frightening just by sheer numbers of people outside. And to see the sheer hate on some of the antis' faces.
You low-life killer! You're a low-life murderer, that's all you are.
They would charge us and we'd close up ranks around the door. And then when a patient came, it was like a flying wedge through this sea of protesters.
With protests disrupting the clinic's operation, organized patient protection became a necessity. A group of women stepped in to defend the clinic by starting the Milwaukee Clinic Protection Coalition, or MCPC.
They would have information that I never knew how they got, and they would know which clinic was going to be targeted, what needed to happen, how many volunteers needed to turn out.
The Milwaukee Police Department counted on the MCPC for information and strategy development.
They wanted to see if they were going to jump, if they were going to rush, and we hated to put a patient through that. So we would run decoys. It was wonderful. And then usually what would happen if they were going to jump, they did. And then they got arrested in huge numbers, and maybe we'd run another decoy, and then we'd bring the patients in.
Of course, we were talking to the patients ahead of time to try to alert them to what it was that they were going to face when they came through and who to look for.
Part of the coalition's strategy was an aggressive legal attack against repeat offenders. David Ritz, a Milwaukee area photographer, took photographs that played a critical role in identifying and prosecuting protesters who broke the law.
Every judge that we appeared in front of would hold up one picture and say, they say that a picture says 1,000 words. This one says it all. Guilty.
Thousands of protesters were arrested during the spring and summer of 1992. Of these arrests, nearly 40 people were held in contempt of court and served jail time or paid a fine.
What it did is activate a whole lot of people in Milwaukee.
There were rows and rows and rows of people standing there with their arms linked, and it was just incredible.
To protect the clinic.
Yeah, it was wonderful. The defenders.
That caliber of protest has not returned, in part due to the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrance Act, or FACE, passed in 1994. This legislation criminalizes violent, obstructive, and threatening behavior towards reproductive health patients and providers. However, smaller-scale protests are a daily part of life for Planned Parenthood health centers all over the state.
People are often really surprised to find out that we have protesters at many of our family planning centers that absolutely do not provide abortion services. And that is because most of the people who don't support legal abortion also don't believe in contraceptives.
It doesn't deter a woman who wants an abortion. If she wants an abortion, she'll walk by a million protesters to come into the center. And for some people, it actually ignites a fire in them to say, that is so inappropriate. I am so sure about my decision. I've thought a ton about it, and I'm making it anyway.
When I worked at the South Clinic, they would come and they would line all up and down Park Street with these huge signs of the fetuses. When they did that, we had more phone calls from supporters. People would call, people say, I'm going to give money. Even businesses sent us food, sent us pizzas, people we have never heard from. We had more positive calls than we ever had negative calls because of the protest.
Planned Parenthood has historically been an organization with absolute tremendous community support. And that is going to be essential to the long-term survival of a vital organization that, again, helps close disparities in healthcare outcomes for women.
Positive community response has been critical during Planned Parenthood's history. Such response became instrumental in 2001 when the Madison Abortion Clinic was informed their lease would not be renewed. A community group of women's health providers created a business plan. They envisioned a comprehensive reproductive health center in Madison that would provide annual exams, cancer screenings, birth control, counseling services, community education, and other sexual health care, including abortion services.
I think that Planned Parenthood has presented a model that is a very good model.
As they did when the Jackson Street Clinic opened a decade earlier, Planned Parenthood knew that owning their building was the best way to protect these services.
We would purchase our own site so that no one, again, could stop the lease. Deborah was determined that we could raise that much money to build a site.
We had the dream that this could happen and that the community would support it. And the community just stepped up and did it. We had to reach out and we had to ask, but when asked, the community really came forward.
While Planned Parenthood was showered with overwhelming community support for the new center, most of the media coverage focused on a small group of protesters.
I don't care if they serve cotton candy when they're in here as well. They're still killing babies. That's the point of this facility. The old facility is closed. They built a brand new, a pretty one, but like I said, it's just dressed up. It's a high-tech, state-of-the-art baby killing facility.
I hate that Planned Parenthood has gotten that image, the pro-abortion stigma around it. It's totally ridiculous. I'm deciding to keep my baby, and they've been nothing but supportive.
Planned Parenthood's options have always included information and referrals for prenatal care and adoption services.
I was very concerned about prenatal care right away. I didn't know what kind of options I had, what was available to me. Planned Parenthood was able to provide me with information, choosing a physician, number one, the different healthcare facilities in the area that were available to me, several state programs that I could possibly enroll in. The people at Planned Parenthood would have been supportive no matter what choice that I would have made.
The human faces and stories of those who make the choice to end a pregnancy are often lost in the debate over the right to make that choice.
When I first became involved in all this, abortion was very objectionable to me. I said I would never support that. When I began to hear those voices on my phone of the desperate situations that people are in, it soon became apparent to me that abortion had to be legal as well.
There are a lot of people that think there's something dirty about you if you get involved in abortion. But there are a lot of women that can't speak out. And fortunately, I can.
I was pretty poorly informed about my sexuality, and I was not particularly young when I had my abortion. I come from an upper middle class family, well educated, and I was very surprised to find myself pregnant.
I was 15 years old. We weren't very careful. You know, when you're a teenager, you just have that feeling that, oh, it's not going to happen to me, what's one time? And it did happen to us. When I found out I was pregnant, there wasn't any doubt in my mind about what I wanted to do. I had plans for school, a career. I certainly wasn't certain that this person I was with was who I wanted to be with for the rest of my life, or who I would want to be the father of my child.
I always felt that I was very pro-choice, but upon finding out I was pregnant, I didn't feel comfortable making that decision, which surprised me at the time. I mean, I didn't think it would be something I would have a hard time deciding. Once I made the decision to keep the baby, I was pretty accepting of it.
I think I was about 41 years old. I felt I had enough children and that I was too old to be having more children. I had no religious objection.
A friend wanted an abortion, and this was in 1968. The only place that we could get an abortion was in Canada. And they had a whole plan. It was like, honestly, I thought I was on the Underground Railroad.
Bring cash, $1,000. $1,000 would be today quite a bit more. Anyone that was poor couldn't have done that.
We were given numbers, how to cross the border, where to go from there, how to get back in the United States with medication, and what to do if something went wrong.
After I graduated from high school, I worked in a hospital laboratory. And the one thing that I remember most clearly is there was an 18-year-old patient in that hospital who had had a shoelace pushed up into her uterus to force an abortion, and she was septic and she was dying, and I was her age. I'm not sure that I even knew what an abortion was, but I sure learned that way.
I was using contraceptives, and I think that my lack of information about my own body was part of the reason that I found myself in this situation.
Well, for the 5 weeks that our child Zoe was alive, we were very happy. The whole experience just was so consuming. I mean, in a good way. You know, we felt very happy about it. My second unplanned pregnancy, it was very unexpected. I had thought that I was obtaining birth control that was going to work for 10 years, and you know, when several months later I found out that it hadn't worked as I was anticipating, it was a pretty big surprise. If I was going to have another child, it was very far away in the future.
It gave me so much more opportunity to experience adolescence, to experience being young.
I have a wonderful family and a beautiful son and a very meaningful, productive life. And I think that's a result of the fact that I was able to make a choice at a time when I was extremely vulnerable.
When I was 5, my mother was ill. I went to the hospital with my daddy, and I remember sitting on the side of the bed, and I took her a grapefruit and some pictures I had drawn, and she was fine, and we expected her to be home soon. So I remember all the funeral things and so forth, and then went on with my life. As an adult, quite a few years after I had been involved with Planned Parenthood, Aunt Mary told me that my mother had died of the complications of an abortion. And I'd never heard any of that before.
He said, are you sure you're pregnant? I said, yes. He said, okay, take off your underpants. Then he proceeded to talk on the telephone. He had a telephone that you operated with a foot pedal. And while he was working on me, he was talking to his wife about what to bring home for dinner. And, you know, it's almost going to make me cry when I talk about this, to think that maybe other women were being subjected to such an indignity.
When we got back to Madison, all of a sudden, she got really sick. We went to Meritor's Hospital. It wasn't called Meritor's at the time, to the emergency room. And how she was treated was disgusting. She was treated like a leper.
I happened to have a skirt on, so I left my skirt on. I took my underpants off and got up on the table. That was it. I didn't even take my shoes off. That can't be much more degrading than that, I don't think. And when I got dressed, he says, put your underpants back on. You can sit here for about 10 minutes, and then I have someone else out there. You'll have to leave by the side door. And he opened the door, and I was gone.
We give women a choice, but we also tell them that one of their choices is not okay.
I think it's really important to put a face to it and say, yes, I had an abortion, I'm not sorry, and I think it's important.
I never told one single friend of mine. I never told my children. My husband knew. We never talked about it. And have I ever regretted it? No.
It's difficult for me to talk about the death of my child because it's a subject that makes people uncomfortable in much the same way that people don't want to hear about the abortion that I've had.
It certainly was an interesting thing to learn that after I'd been working at this like a demon for so many years, that my own mother had died of an abortion.
That really, really just ignited a fire in me and said, this is where I need to be. This is what I want to do. I want to work for women's rights. Every woman should have the right to make a decision when she wants to have children.
I just feel that I made the right choice for myself, and I have no regrets.
One of the huge successes of the anti-abortion movement has been to make women feel guilty about having abortions, more than to stop them from doing it.
Even people who are supportive of abortion rights feel like they need to label this as this very, very tragic experience. The tragedy lies in the fact that women don't have health care.
The focus of the issue becomes abortion, but sometimes the objection goes far deeper than abortion. It goes to the issue of sexuality. It goes to the issue of the right of all women, regardless of their age or marital status, having access to birth control. They're deeply held beliefs, and I support an individual's right to hold those beliefs, but my support stops where their beliefs begin to interfere with the right of others.
Most women who are faced with an unplanned pregnancy take a very long look and make a very thoughtful and considerate moral decision about their future.
When they come to this decision, they have to have a safe place to go.
I went into OBGYN residency knowing that learning abortion services was very important to me. I feel an obligation to provide that for my patients rather than shipping them off to someone else to have that part of their care.
Some of my young women, college students that I saw when I started practice, stayed with me. I delivered their babies. They were postmenopausal women when I retired from private practice. They stayed with me all those years.
The Supreme Court of the United States has repeatedly said this is a fundamental issue of privacy. This grows out of a right of privacy, a right for people in this country and in this state to make these deeply, deeply private decisions on their own.
This right to privacy turns into a public political debate during many elections, including unrelated races like school board and county commissioners.
Frankly, I don't think that politicians, either at the state or federal level,
ought to be weighing in on this issue at all. Many other Supreme Court cases have been decided, constitutional rights have been articulated, and that's it. That's the end of it. And this is one of the few constitutional rights that has been under attack almost every day since the decision came down.
Legislation that's emerged since Roe v. Wade has actually worked to tighten access to abortions in this country.
The Hyde Amendment, passed in 1976 and still in effect today, bars the use of public funds for abortion services unless a woman's life is at risk. This law is particularly burdensome for teens and low-income women. In Wisconsin, a mandatory waiting period requires women to visit an abortion provider at least 24 hours before they can obtain their procedure. Conflicts in scheduling, travel, work, and childcare generally delay the procedure by at least a week, pushing the woman further into her pregnancy.
There is a dilemma for competent OB/GYN physicians who are pro-choice, who would like to provide the services, who find that hard to do in their office or in a hospital or as a volunteer at Planned Parenthood, because they actually cannot make the decisions anymore. They are employed by healthcare systems, they work for large multi-specialty clinics, and it is these systems that actually decide for them.
Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin is committed to increasing the number of available providers. They have established a formal OB/GYN residency training program at their Madison Health Center and are expanding to Milwaukee.
So we're hoping that by reinstituting standard routine training in abortion and family planning, that even if not all of those residents go out and provide in their practice in the future, they just really have a more accurate understanding of what we do, why we do it, and what their patients experience when they come to a clinic outside of their usual care.
As the struggle continues to educate, new challenges echoing fights of the past emerge.
It's amazing at this time that we're still debating whether people should have access to birth control. I know the contentious part of the abortion issue is there, but it's very likely bills will be coming to my desk that would restrict access to various birth control.
Basic reproductive health care is under siege in America today. And what has been a movement against a woman's right to a safe and legal abortion has now become a massive attack on birth control itself.
One major step backwards is a flurry of new legislation allowing healthcare workers to deny care, which they personally oppose. This includes treatments for infertility, referrals for prenatal tests, prescriptions for birth control, and even information about these services.
A bill passed the legislature that said that if a pharmacist, and by the way, it extended to doctors, other medical providers, but if a pharmacist had a belief that they didn't agree in dispensing legal prescription pharmaceuticals, that they could just say no.
Some of you might have seen a story recently about a woman who was refused access right here at this Walgreens to emergency contraception.
Jane told us, I tried to explain to her that it's emergency contraceptives. It's not an abortion pill.
She was berated.
Jane said the pharmacist berated her by saying, you're a murderer. I will not help you kill this baby.
She got pregnant. She ended up having an abortion because she was denied access.
Jane was not the only Walgreens customer who was denied her prescription for emergency contraception.
The physician's assistant called me back and said, they will not fill it. I cannot believe this. She was outraged. And, my initial reaction wasn't outrage. It was, I guess, shock, because this assistant, the doctor's right-hand person, could not get a prescription filled for me.
Sponsors of birth control refusal bills call these strategies conscience clauses. Planned Parenthood calls these clauses denial of health care, which more accurately defines their effect on patients.
Go into a pharmacy, you're not expecting a moral lecture, you're expecting somebody to do their job, which is you have a prescription, you give them the prescription, and it's their job to fill the prescription.
Currently in Wisconsin, less than half of emergency rooms even tell rape victims about emergency contraception as an option in preventing pregnancy, and even less dispense it when it's requested by the victim. The irony here is the American Medical Association has already said, look, this is standard of care. This should be happening in every hospital emergency room.
Many politicians pushing to limit abortion and birth control refuse to recognize the other critical services Planned Parenthood provides.
I think increasingly Planned Parenthood has become the last resort for cervical cancer preventive services, for sexual transmitted disease prevention and treatment services, for patients who have problems with access to the regular healthcare system.
Threats to these services, however, are still very real and not always apparent to the public or the people who rely on them most. In many ways, the present seems no more a friend to birth control than the past. Prescription denial, 24-hour waiting periods, parental consent laws, severed funding, abstinence-only education, and, of course, the ever-present threat to Roe v. Wade. Since its inception, Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin's Public Affairs Department has dedicated itself to strengthening women's health by advocating progressive legislation and educating the public.
It's essential that they at least be a voice that's out talking about these issues.
Most of my time is spent trying to convince people in the legislature to do the right thing, but then the other half is spent figuring out how are we going to get rid of these people who don't support basic health care for women.
What do we want? Women's rights! When do we want it? Now!
At the end of the day, my job is to represent our organization, but to also represent our patients and make sure that their rights to get access to the best health care that we can provide is never ever compromised.
We are here to make the world a better place, and I believe that.
Until women can fully participate on an equal basis with men, we're getting half of humanity's gifts.
The main impact in modern society of birth control is both to reduce family size, but also to cope with a world in which women function as full citizens, economic citizens, political citizens, social citizens.
This is not a partisan issue. This is something that affects all of us, whether we're Democrat or Republican, rich or poor. It's something that we all need.
It's going to be a long struggle. Winning a right doesn't mean that you're done, because hanging on to that right can often be very hard.
Freedom requires eternal vigilance, and I think women have to be very vigilant about having some of their freedoms taken away.
I don't want to even fathom what our country would look like without Planned Parenthood.
There is nothing that guarantees poverty more than an early pregnancy for which you're not ready. Pregnancy is a 25 to 30-year condition, at least, and to be able to follow through on that is enormously expensive, and to do it right. Planned Parenthood is actually preventing poverty by allowing women to develop fully before they reproduce.
Planned Parenthood is about Planned Parenthood, and it's not just about abortion by any means, and it's not even necessarily about contraception. It's about having people think through and make decisions that are best for them and best for their children.
Women's lives are so incredibly complicated today, and we need to acknowledge that, and we need to give them every tool that we have to be able to manage it. I feel that Planned Parenthood does a really good job doing that.
Thank you. Thank you for being there. Thank you for standing up for women. Thank you for standing up for men. Thank you for standing up for all of us and saying that, reproductive rights are an essential part of being human.
There's so many worthwhile causes, worthwhile organizations, and I was just getting overwhelmed by it all. How do I help with all these problems that are, existent in society and the world? It gradually came to me that Planned Parenthood was somehow involved at the ground level, that a lot of the other problems that we're trying to address in society could actually be prevented if people came into the world wanted and loved.
I am more convinced than I ever was that the huge majority of people in the world, men and women, believe that birth control is a fundamental right and an absolute necessity. With that behind us, we obviously are not going to lose, but it's still going to take a struggle.
So we continue to be the defenders.
What can I learn from you? In your lifetime, what you've been through, how'd you keep your head up and hold your pride? In an insane world, how'd you keep on trying? One life can tell the tale, that if you make the effort, you cannot fail. By your life you tell me it can be done. By your life's the courage to carry on. Heroes appear like a friend to clear a path or light the flame. As time goes, you find you depend on your heroes to show you the way. Heroes. What can I learn from you? That I must do the thing I think I cannot do. That you do what's right by your heart and soul. It's the imperfections that make us whole. One life can tell the tale, that if you make the effort, you cannot fail. By your life you tell me it can be done. By your life's the courage to carry on. Heroes appear like a friend to clear a path or light the flame. As time goes, you find you depend on your heroes to show you the way. Sojourner Truth, Eleanor Roosevelt, Katharine Hepburn, Sally Ride, Susan B. Anthony, Harriet Tubman, Annie Sullivan, Gertrude Stein, Coretta Scott King, Amelia Earhart, Lillian Hellman, Eartha Kitt, Sacagawea, Ella Fitzgerald, Golda Meir, Dorothy Dix, Louisa May Alcott, Billie Jean King, Emily Dickinson, Lucy Stone, Margaret Sanger, Clara Barton, Billie Holiday, Juliette Lowe, Elizabeth Blackwell, Rosa Parks, Lena Horne, Beverly Sills, Barbara Jordan, Helen Keller, Indira Gandhi, Agnes DeMille, Corazon Aquino, Gloria Steinem, Rachel Carson, Joan of Arc, Babes Zaharias, Marlene Dietrich, and Frank Simone de Beauvoir.